Christian people, Christian believers who advocate for drinking wine have one basic argument. Believers in the Old Testament drank wine, believers in the New Testament drank wine, that settles the case, right? That's always the argument. Which then brought up our first point. Is the wine today, or the alcoholic beverage today, the same as it was in biblical times? Are we talking about apples and apples here? And the answer to the question is no. And I used an analogy, and I'm going to repeat it just briefly. The Bible never condemns slavery. The Bible never condemns slavery in the Old Testament, never condemns slavery in the New Testament. In fact, it used slavery as an analogy of how we are to relate to Jesus Christ. He's the master and we're slaves. In the Old Testament, people had slaves, and that was okay. Slaves were to be obedient to their masters. Masters were to be kind to their slaves. In the New Testament, it was the same thing. So you might say to me, where do I go to buy some slaves? They had slaves in the Bible. They had slaves in the Old Testament. They had slaves in the New Testament. I need some slaves. I want to be a full-orbed Christian. I need slaves. It's a different world that we live in today. Very different world. Nobody would advocate that. No Christian would advocate that. It's analogous to saying because people drank in the Old Testament, drank in the New Testament, we need to go drink alcoholic beverages. But wait a minute. Are we talking about the same thing? What slavery is today is human trafficking. Very different than a benevolent system which took people who were destitute in and made them part of the family and gave them care in exchange for work. So we asked that question, and the answer to the question was wine, both in the Old and the New Testament, was very different than it is today because it was diluted. There's all kinds of evidence, replete evidence, that the people who drank wine in ancient times, even people who were non-Christian people, drank wine mixed with water 3 to 1, as high as 20 to 1. In other words, up to 20 to 1 parts of water, 20 parts of water, 1 part of wine, down to 3 parts water, 1 part of wine. We gave you all kinds of indications of the fact that drinking undiluted wine was viewed as barbaric. And do you remember that I told you the primary point was this, that it was a sanitary provision by God in a fallen world that wine or any other fruit ferments because fermentation produces within the fermented juice deadly killers of bacteria. What they did was purify their water by mixing it with fermented wine because the properties of fermentation act to kill the bacteria. And I told you that almost every bacteria, a Salmonella, Staphylococcus, and I named a whole bunch of others, will be dead in 60 minutes at the most, 30 to 60 minutes in any kind of liquid like that. And people in ancient times felt that to drink unmixed drink was barbaric. Wine in those days would have a 2 to 4% alcohol content, maybe as high as 12 to 14 in the Gentile world. But by the time it was diluted down and sometimes boiled and then remixed with water, in a very hot climate, it needed to be, or you would be drunk whether you wanted to be drunk or not. And it was a protection. That's why Paul said to Timothy, take a little wine for your stomach's sake, because it'll help kill the bacteria. So we're not talking about the same kind of thing. So we answered the question, was the beverage they drank in the Bible times the same as today, when you have undiluted alcoholic drinks that go all the way up to 75% alcohol? Far cry from what they consumed in Bible times. And that's the first question. Number 2, let's ask a second question. Is drinking alcoholic beverage necessary? And the answer to that would be what? No. We would all agree with that. You don't need it to kill the bacteria. It's purely a matter of choice today. So the first question is, was it the same as today? No. Second question, is it necessary? No. Purely a choice. Okay, thirdly, is it the best choice? Is it the best choice? Let's phrase the question a little bit different. If you want to be sure that you avoid drunkenness, is it the best choice? Does that help? If you want to be sure you avoid drunkenness, is it the best choice? No. Again, it's a question of your choice. We want to take the high ground, don't we? It's not necessary. We've already established that, just plain and simple. And now it's a question of choice. There might be some compelling things in Scripture that would help us to make the best choice. So let's take a look at them. Let's go back to Leviticus chapter 10. Leviticus chapter 10. We'll just work our way through a few things here in this little lesson. There were a couple of guys named Nadab and Abihu. Remember them? Sons of Aaron. And they took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. Aaron's the high priest, right? So they're in the priestly line. They're supposed to be doing priestly duties. What are they doing? What are they doing? They're doing something weird. The only way it can be described is strange fire. God had prescribed how the fire was to be placed on the altar, how the incense was to be presented, and they did something different than what God had commanded. They went in there and did something that was out of line. So fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them. They died. They tampered with the prescription for the incense, and it cost them their life. What did they do? They offered strange fire. Why would they do that? Well, they wouldn't have done it if they'd have been thinking. So maybe something affected how they were thinking. You say, well, why would you say that? Well, it's just a thought. Down to verse 8. After the Lord had killed his two sons, the Lord spoke to Aaron, and what did he say? Don't do what? Don't drink wine, strong drink. Don't you think there might be a connection here? Not you, not your sons with you when you come into the tent of meeting, so that you will not die. I think they were doing weird stuff because they couldn't think clearly. They were drunk. Don't do that, so that you will not die. And make it a perpetual statute through your generation, the whole priestly line, so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean. Look, what happens when you're drunk is you can't make distinctions. Well, you don't know the difference between reality and fantasy, unreality. And teach it to all the sons of Israel. You're going to be the teacher of Israel. You're going to have to make distinctions. How can you do that if you're inebriated? In Titus, and I'll just show you this quickly. Well, let's look at 1 Timothy 3, and then we'll do Titus. 1 Timothy 3, where you have the qualifications for an overseer, an elder, pastor. Verse 3, not addicted to wine, that's the NAS, not addicted to wine. Literally, we're talking about not beside wine. Verse 8, deacons, nor addicted to much wine. Not attached to wine. Careful about that. Those who are leaders, those who make decisions, those who are arbitrators, those who are kings, those who are rulers, those who are mediators, those who are teachers of the truth of God, those who represent God to the people and the people before God as priests, maintain the standard even in biblical times. Elders are not to be beside wine, and deacons, it says, are not to be attached to much wine. The standard is higher, I guess, in a sense there for elders because so much more is at stake. So all of that simply to say this: what's the highest ground? What's the highest choice? That which is established by those who have the most responsibility and influence. I don't miss this message, and that's why I don't and never have consumed alcoholic beverages. Why would I do that when I have the measure of responsibility I have? The spiritual responsibility? I don't want my senses dulled. I want to have discernment. I want to teach accurately the Word of God. So, is it the same? No. Is it necessary? No. Is it the highest and the best? No. Let's try another question. Is it habit forming? Is it habit forming? This is a very basic and foundational question. And by the way, it could be applied to a whole lot of behaviors, couldn't it? A whole lot of them. Listen to 1 Corinthians 6:12. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. Why? Because all things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. I will not be brought under the power of anything. Does it have the potential to bring me under its power? Is it expedient? I love the old, the authorized, all things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. That's a great English word. Expedient. It actually comes from the Latin root ped, which is your feet. Does it free my feet? That's literally it. Or is it going to tangle me up, trip me up, take me captive, shackle me? Well, we all know the answer to that. Alcohol has the potential to create dependency. It can be habit-forming and at the same time mind-controlling. Now, we're all creatures of habit, right? I mean, down to little basic things. You like a certain kind of toothpaste, you shave your face starting on the same side every time and moving to the other side. And you get up and do the same routines every day, and we all have habits. And some of you love your coffee in the morning, or in my case, my pot of tea in the morning, get me going. That's a habit, but that is not a habit that has the potential to take control of my mind and alter my behavior. But alcohol can create a chemical dependency and a mind-altering power contained in it at the same time makes it very dangerous. And we all know the terrible stories of alcoholics who can't come off of it, whose lives are ravaged and ruined. 38 million alcoholics as of now in the United States. So, is it the same? No. Is it necessary? No. Is it the best? No. Is it potentially habit-forming? Now the answer is different. Yes. Now let's take it a step further. Number 5, is it potentially destructive? Is it potentially destructive? Yes, because I just read you in Ephesians 5:18 that it can lead to asotia. Asotia is the verb that is, or the noun that is translated dissipation. Asotia, originally, the root word means incurably, hopelessly sick. Or one who by his manner of life is self-destructive. That's what dissipation means. The concept of asotia is a person who by his manner of life is self-destructive. Can alcohol have that potential? Can it be destructive? Oh, you could talk about sclerosis of the liver. That's one area where we all know alcohol can be destructive. It can even produce a horrible, horrible ballooning of the veins of the esophagus, and there are all kinds of terrible things it can do physiologically. But can it be destructive in relationships? Can it destroy your purity? Can it so alter your judgment that you sin openly, willingly, boldly, blatantly, because the restraints are removed? People do weird things when they're drunk. Noah did. Noah must have been a respectable man. I mean, when the Lord drowned the whole human race, He kept Noah. And Noah must have been the guy that influenced Mrs. Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives, and those are the 8 that God saved. And then the picture you have of Noah after the flood, what does he do? He gets drunk. Now, let's give him maybe a little bit of a break. Maybe post-flood, fermentation happened faster. That's possible. But what happened when he got drunk? It was embarrassing. It was shameful. He lost his dignity. Middle Eastern men, they don't lose their dignity. No one should lose his dignity. So that's the question. Can it be destructive? Can it lead to dissipation and destruction? The wisdom of the book of Proverbs weighs in on this. You will remember this. Wine is a mocker, chapter 20, verse 1. Strong drink, a brawler, and whoever is intoxicated by it is not wise. No, because destructive things happen. And then in Proverbs chapter 21, verse 17, he who loves wine will not become rich. Drunks don't get rich. And in Proverbs 23, verse 21, the heavy drinker and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe him with rags. We see that all the time, don't we? Now we have this new category of people called the homeless. Well, bless them, my heart goes out to them, but they're not the homeless, they're the alcoholics. They're the drunks in our culture, for the most part. And it's a heartbreaking reality. Proverbs 23, verse 31, don't look on the wine when it's red, when it sparkles in the cup and it looks so inviting. When it goes down smoothly. At last it bites like a serpent, stings like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things. Your mind will utter perverse things. That's the point, isn't it? And you'll be like somebody who lies down in the middle of the sea. Not a good idea. Or like one who lies down on the top of a mast. That's a stupid idea too. Now we're warned about that, the potential destructive power of alcohol. Is it the same? No. Is it necessary? No. Is it the best? No. Is it habit-forming? Yes. Is it potentially destructive? Yes. Question number 6. Is it offensive to others, particularly other Christians? You know, you may be convinced that you have all the freedom you want, and there's a flaunting of freedom. Oh, there's an ugly, ugly flaunting of freedom among some of these young guys who call themselves pastors. It's just heartbreaking, a narcissistic kind of, I'm going to live my life, I couldn't care less what you think. You know, we may be convinced that our maturity and our strength supersedes our vulnerability, and we can control absolutely anything in our freedom. But I told you last week, Darren Patrick's book called The Church Planter, the book for the young generation of church planters, says the biggest problem among these young pastors is drunkenness. What kind of a testimony is that? Is that an offense to others? I'm going to have to take into consideration the people around me. For one, I don't want to liberate former alcoholics to drink, because they can't without sinking into the same marasm that they came out of. I don't want to lead people who are young people who don't drink to drink, because some of them will become binge drinkers. And they'll justify what they did because they saw me do it. In other words, I don't want to be the cause of someone's drinking. I don't want to be the justification for someone's drinking, because I don't want to be the stumbling block. Now, that's an important thing for me. That's an important thing for you as well, because you have people looking at your life. Start with your children. You don't want your child to be a binge drinker. You don't want your child to be an alcoholic. You don't want your child to have his judgment skewed and drive his car like two teenagers did down the street near our house 2 weeks ago, into a tree and kill one of them, put the other one in critical care. You don't want that to happen to your kids. You don't ever want to be a stumbling block even to the person who feels that drinking is sinful because they come out of a culture of drinking, and now that they've come to Christ, they see that as a part of their past. That's what was going on in the church. 1 Corinthians 8, take care that this liberty of yours doesn't somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. There are believers that have a weak conscience. You know, if you grew up in the bars and the saloons and did what people do in that kind of lifestyle, and then you came to Christ, all that goes with that lifestyle will be part of the ugliness of your sinful past. And you wouldn't have the freedom to go back into that situation, because it would reek of all that the Lord delivered you from. I will never use my liberty to offend someone else. I'm happy to put my liberty aside. After all, it's not necessary to drink, and it's not the best to drink. It's not the highest and the best. And that leads me to the seventh, will it harm my testimony? Can it harm my testimony? And I've already answered that question. It can. I want to do all to the glory of God. I don't want anybody to think less of me as a Christian. I'm happy to set aside any freedom for the sake of a clear, clean Christian testimony. And that just leads me to an eighth point, and it's sort of carrying everything into one little final thought. Am I absolutely certain this is a behavior that is right? I mean, that's where I get with things like this. Will God be disappointed if I don't do this? Now you say, well, you could ask that about coffee or anything else. Well, I know. But still, that thought comes into my mind. Will I be absolutely sure that my conscience will not accuse me and God will be pleased if I do this? And that's sort of Romans 15. We want to please our neighbor for his good and his edification. For even Christ didn't please himself. I understand that. That's my desire, to do nothing that offends someone else. But beyond that, I want to do everything I do to glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Verse 6, just as Christ accepted us to the glory of God. So I want to think of it not only as to how it affects others, but I want to ask the question, would God somehow be disappointed if I didn't do this? Is this a means and a way in which I can glorify Him?